Welcome to Linked Heritage, a podcast about museums and Wikipedia. I'm Bea, and I'll be taking you through the intersections and relationships between the free encyclopedia and the world of heritage, whether that be digital heritage, museums, or world heritage. Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, is known as the most popular source of information on the internet, and it's home to a wealth of knowledge specifically about heritage, all brought together by editors around the world from other sources like books, news, websites, and more. We're about to explore the stories of this website's attempts to reach out and touch the world of heritage, which haven't always been successful. From budding Wikipedia editors to the website's power players, and from the originator of the Wikipedian in residence to the creator of the Museum of All Things, we'll be joined by a variety of interviewees from across the GlamWiki community, where galleries, libraries, archives, and museums work alongside the Wikimedia Foundation's countless grassroots projects and initiatives. Can Wikipedia influence heritage, and can they work together? Could we call Wikipedia itself heritage? Episode 2. Could Wikipedia influence heritage? In this episode, we ask how Wikipedia could help to modernise the institutions of heritage. We'll take a look at the encyclopedic idea of the Index Museum and how it's influenced London's Natural History Museum for over a century, and then ask if museums should adopt the idea of open authority. Part 1. What is an Index Museum? The idea of a museum is actually much closer to the idea of an encyclopedia than we might think. We can jump all the way back to 1902, when a Scottish man, known as Sir Patrick Geddes, variously referred to as a biologist, sociologist, botanist, geographer, urban planner, educator, founder of museums, schools and institutions, leader of meetings and associations, poet and guru, wrote an unpublished manuscript, Museum, Actual and Possible, in which he outlined his idea of an index museum. What then is an index museum? First of all, more than an ordinary museum, it is not only an encyclopedia, but an encyclopedia graphica. That is, we may think of it as an encyclopedia of which the articles may be imagined printed separately, and with their illustrations and maps condensed and displayed as an orderly series of labels. Labels to which specimens are then as far as possible supplied, so that over and above in the description, the image, the interpretation of the thing, you can see the thing itself in reality if possible, or in reproduction or model as the case may be. Nor is this so difficult as it appears. Every museum is more or less doing this, and often in very considerable measure. While Geddes is telling us that you can create a museum that is similar in form to an encyclopedia, he's also telling us that museums already do this all the time. Museums can act as visual and more recently interactive encyclopedias, giving out information in an equally organised and attended to way. They also serve society in similar ways, educating people in large numbers, usually from an institutional perspective. This idea of the Index Museum has been far from forgotten. If we look at Hintze Hall from London's Natural History Museum, we can see that the idea has survived in some form in the country's capital. This all comes from Geddes's work alongside Richard Owen, Superintendent of the Department of Natural History of the British Museum in the 1850s, both agreeing that museums, at least the ones in the city, should offer a comprehensive, philosophic and connected view of the natural world. Owen decided to split the museum into two, with one side for the natural history of the British Isles, and the other acting as an index for the provinces, classes and orders and genera of the animal kingdom. This came to be known as the Index Museum. In this way, each group was represented in Hintze Hall by a selection of typical or important specimens from that group. For mammals, for example, an African elephant was placed on display, and, fun fact, was later named George. Owen's efforts to display every species they had available did get a bit of pushback from others, who believed displaying only a few specimens was enough. Early on in the development of the museum, Keeper of Zoology John Edward Gray attacked Owen's overall vision for the museum as a chaos of specimens, and Gray's successor called it an anachronism from a time when the British Museum's natural history cases were overcrowded and didn't have proper labelling. The thing is, these objections weren't unfounded. When you list out a single room like an encyclopedia directory, an exhibition is bound to get messy. Owen retired before the Natural History Museum opened and before he could see through his idea. He was replaced by William Henry Flower, who instead of complying with Owen's strict taxonomy, instead decided to arrange the hall by visually communicating principles of nature, and was praised for the visual appeal of this changed vision of the exhibition which opened in the late 1880s. Though a little watered down from the original idea, Richard Owen's encyclopedic method of organisation remains today in Hintze Hall. When the hall was transformed in 2017 to how it appears nowadays, this idea was still at the forefront of its design, and now Hope, the skeleton of a blue whale, is suspended from the ceiling to represent the mammals on display in the rest of the museum. The 10 arched display bays along the sides of the hall reflect this idea, with both extinct and extant species represented as a directory from a singular room. Placing these next to each other, the museum argues, demonstrates that our actions can have both devastating and revolutionary effects on our planet. Encyclopedias continue to have a drastic impact on the way we organise the world, and particularly museum exhibitions like this one, even when they've changed so drastically. This all seems great when it comes to taxonomy and animals, but what about when it comes to other subjects that might appear in a museum? Could the biases of traditional museums cause problems when it comes to this kind of categorization from the Enlightenment era? Does Wikipedia have a chance of solving such a problem when it itself is subject to its own strong biases? Part 2. Could open authority help? Open authority may just be the solution. Open authority refers to the coming together of the museum authority with the principles of the open web, a mixing of institutional expertise with the discussions, experiences, and insights of broad audiences. She combined two different metaphors from two different academics. Duncan F. Cameron said in 1971 that a museum could be both a temple and a forum, where the temple represents a museum's unquestionable authority, and the forum represents a museum's openness to community dialogue. Similarly, Eric S. Raymond's 1997 essay advocates for the internet to go through a shift from a closed cathedral to an open bazaar of software development. Combining the two as Phillips did, the temple and the bazaar advocates for Wikipedia to become a platform for museums through this idea of open authority. I interviewed a couple of Wikipedia editors over the course of this project, and let them speak their minds about museums being more open to dialogue and participation from their communities, just like Wikipedia is. Just like on Wikipedia, they range in their experience level, but their inputs are equally valued. I talked to a less experienced editor.
I've been using Wikipedia for as long as I can remember, basically. That's like one of the first things that's mentioned on my user page. I'm quite new to the editing side of things though. I only became an editor in May. My work on Wikipedia is mainly of the maintenance variety. So a lot of my work involves fixing links, adding wiki links, so like links to other articles, rephrasing sentences, things like that. I do dabble in translation as well. I quite recently translated an article from the French Wikipedia about someone called Antonella Lurca-Duda, who is a Romanian activist, and that recently went through the articles for creation process and it got accepted. So yeah, I've quite recently technically made a new article as well.
And a more experienced editor and administrator of Wikipedia, Tamzin Kelly.
It's been like 16 years since I made my first edit of any sort. It's been, I think, 13 years since I registered this account, and it's been about 4 years since I started editing a lot. I edit about law, religion, politics, LGBTQ topics, violence, and the intersections thereof. My proudest articles are probably Mike Tyson's tattoos. I didn't think, I was like, there may be room for a little article on his face tattoo or something. And it was like, there are scholarly sources in like 5 different disciplines discussing Mike Tyson's tattoos. And then I've also proud of work I've done, like 2 very different articles that I was shocked no one had made before. One, an article on the zine Fucking Trans Women by Myra Bellwether. We didn't have an article on the Misha Berach, which is technically a category of prayers in Judaism, but it includes the Misha Berach for healing, which is probably the most culturally significant prayer in liberal Judaism, at least in the US, I think also in the UK. I completely rewrote our article on Capri Sun. It was kind of a joke with a friend, and we just ran with it and wrote more and more. We think it might be the most comprehensive work on Capri Sun as a cohesive topic. One thing I really like writing about is relatively recent but forgotten events. I've written about things like there was this time in the 80s where a bunch of off-duty Army Rangers had a shootout with some drug dealers in Tacoma, Washington, or this big skydiving disaster in the 60s that was like the worst skydiving disaster in US history.
I asked them, should Wikipedia be trusted to collaborate with museums?
There's a saying that Wikipedia works in practice, but not in theory. I think the reason people don't think something like Wikipedia would work is that people tend to overestimate the number of like overt bad actors in any space. I think part of that might just be like a very like practical distinction that the things that give you a sense in a physical environment of how many bad actors are around are usually things where you can't tell exactly how many people are involved. So like there's the number of broken windows you can count while walking down a city block. But do you know how many people broke those windows? So that could be one person on a night, and then that wouldn't actually tell you that much about the area. Or this could be endemic and it happens all the time. And I think people tend to assume, they see lots of bad things in a place, and therefore that must be the percentage of society who are just like bad people and will break things if you give them the chance. I think what Wikipedia shows is that's just like not true. It's not that there isn't evil in people or mischief in people, but there's the human desire to not spend time doing things outweighs a lot of that. We make it take a click, at least one keystroke, and then at least one more click to edit a page. And that's enough deterrent for most bad things. And I mean, obviously, there's gradations of things you want to keep out in a wiki or in a museum, because you have the vandalism, sure, but then you also have the kind of deliberate hoaxes or misunderstandings that are effectively the same as hoaxes. I have found in my time on Wikipedia some cases where there were very elaborate hoaxes that were framed in a way that just sounded plausible. For a while, I had the record for the oldest hoax statement found in an article, which was the claim that the Louvre pyramid was originally supposed to have a spire for ease of window washing. Someone had added that in 2007. They added it complete with the citation needed tag. And that weirdly made it look more plausible, because it's like, when you see citation needed, you kind of think, well, someone looked at this and thought it's not worth removing outright. By the time I got to it, like 15 years later, there were published books saying this. And I had to go through them one at a time and confirm that each of them post-stated the addition to the article. I imagine you would probably want a bit more control than we do, because like fundamentally we have a number of review processes, but we don't have any generally applicable mandatory review system. We have pending changes, but that's only used in a small percentage of articles. We have edit filters, but they're only used for very obviously bad stuff for the most part. They're simple machines and they can't tell whether you're misrepresenting a source. They can just tell whether you've put the N-word in all caps. And then we have human review of recent changes, but that's not guaranteed either. And then and bot review, but which is AI. So things always will slip through the cracks, and we take that risk. Some wikis don't take that risk. I think like the German Wikipedia requires every single edit to be vetted by another editor before it goes live to the general public until someone has proven themselves. The truth with that is it barely works on the wikis it does work on. The Russian and Ukrainian Wikipedias both do this, and it seems like halfway a good idea until they suddenly had a lot of stuff going on in their lives. And now you'll see things where the pages are a year out of date because people are too caught up living through an actual war to go on Wikipedia and say, yes, that edit was correct to change this person's birthday from January to February. But there's a spectrum of review depending on a wiki's needs.
Wikipedia is still going nearly, 25 years later, and has massive community behind it. like it's a very highly trusted source of information. When I Google something, more often than not, I'll check the Wikipedia page for that thing. And I think what makes Wikipedia work is the way that's run. And if museums want to lean more into that, I don't see why not. I feel like by knowing what people want and setting up like exhibitions and events accordingly, I feel like that's a good way to bring in more visitors, which in turn will bring in more money for the museum. So everyone wins. Especially these days when a lot of news websites have their articles behind paywalls, for example. I think free and open access to information is really important. And I wanted to play a part in preserving that really. And that's why I became an editor. And I think it's especially important for history and heritage as well, because a lot of people say if we don't learn about history, we're doomed to repeat it. So, like having historical events documented in a way that's completely free and accessible is a great way to preserve that.
I also asked Tamzin what lessons they wanted museums to take from Wikipedia.
Integrating with Wikipedia is cool, and I'm definitely never against it. But you're talking about a Venn diagram that is close to concentric circles. The really cool thing is to look at the lessons learned from the wiki model and how that can apply to the preservation of knowledge generally. Wikipedia, one of our core rules, is no original research, right? Even if I know something to be absolutely certain, I cannot just cite myself unless I've published that somewhere else that's a reliable source. There are very successful wikis that don't take that rule. Most notably, maybe Intellipedia, the CIA's in-house wiki, encourages members to say, like, hey, if in your personal experience, this is a good tactic to bribe government officials in whatever country, go post that there, cite yourself. You're the expert. And it apparently works, according to people who are involved in this. Like, they have a successful wiki that does use original research. So there's something I think for a museum to learn there of like, could you have more of just putting together stories and narratives based on who's in a community, who remembers something, who says what? There's something to be said for just accepting that like error is a natural part of propagating information and that there is a use in understanding the whole story as best understood by the consensus of the masses, even if that's certainly not going to be 100% correct, because the full story as understood by the one person who spent years getting a PhD on that story is also not going to be 100% correct. There's more to learn from the wiki model philosophically than there is to learn just from the kind of naive approach of let's do Wikipedia. But it's also still fine to do the latter.
Radical trust has been perhaps a more extreme version of open authority on the edges of archiving and curation. Defined by Rose Sherman of the Minnesota Historical Society as when historical institutions become centers for civil engagement, where people gather to meet and converse and participate in collaborative problem solving, this type of interaction with heritage has grown massively in the digital age as websites have allowed members of the public, and particularly younger people, to contribute to historical projects. And there are a couple of times where it's actually gone into practice. Inspired by its head curator E.J. Scott's collection of souvenirs from their gender transition, the Museum of Transology was set up in 2014. It's a collection of objects representing the histories and lived experiences of trans people across the United Kingdom that's grown exponentially over the years it's been active. The Museum of Transology makes use of radical trust, allowing trans people to donate anything they themselves feel is important, and the collection is all the better for it. Perhaps a truer representation of this minority compared to their representation in the media. All said, the idea of open authority, which has a little more expert control over what happens in a heritage space, is not that radical of an idea.
Wikipedia is all about building a community and democratizing access to information. I think having those connections with those kinds of people, like people who have access to like all these kinds of information, I don't see how that can be a bad thing.
More participation is always a good thing, and I think the wiki model shows that with only a little bit of gatekeeping involved, you can get people to show up and consistently get good stuff from them. Most people who want to contribute will want to contribute positively.
As we've seen, the world of heritage has flirted with encyclopedias since the early 1900s, to some real success and to some chaos. With participation being such a big part of how museums are trying to modernise, and museum professionals being cautiously ready to open up further, and with Wikipedians agreeing that this relationship needs to be fostered, it's only logical that we continue the influence of encyclopedias in museums in a way that's relevant to the present day. Maybe if heritage could embrace and take inspiration from the ideas of open authority, it could help heritage to become more open, participatory, and inclusive as it moves into the future. Next episode, we'll be asking whether Wikipedia and heritage can work together more directly. Who are the women in red, and could a certain type of Wikipedian be the secret ingredient? Thank you for listening to this episode of Linked Heritage. This podcast is written, recorded, and produced by B. Campbell. Thank you to my 2 Wikipedian interviewees, including Tamzin Kelly. Thank you for listening.